Jesus Christ, it's really her. The words came out of Ethan Carlisle's mouth like he'd seen a ghost. 1 second earlier, the whole table had been laughing at me. My father was grinning with a bourbon glass in one hand, enjoying himself the way he always did when people paid attention to him. "Don't mind Hannah," he'd said. "She just fixes radios for the Navy." Claire laughed first. Then her friends joined in. Even the waiter smiled politely like he was expected to. I was reaching for my iced tea when Ethan froze. His eyes locked onto the black phone case sitting beside my plate. More specifically, the small silver insignia clipped to the back of it. A tiny symbol most civilians wouldn't recognize. But Ethan recognized it. And whatever color he'd had in his face disappeared instantly. "Jesus Christ," he whispered again. Nobody moved. Even the jazz music in the restaurant suddenly felt too loud. Then Ethan did something I'll never forget. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor, straightened his back like a soldier reporting to command, and looked directly at me. Not at Claire. Not at my father. At me. And for the first time that entire evening, nobody in the room was laughing anymore. 3 hours earlier, I almost hadn't gone to the dinner at all. The rain had been coming down sideways across Norfolk that afternoon, the kind of cold Atlantic rain that soaked through your coat before you reached your car. I'd just finished a 12-hour shift at Naval Station Norfolk and was sitting alone in my truck outside the base gate debating whether family obligation was worth the headache. Claire had called twice already. "You better not embarrass me tonight," she'd said during the second voicemail. "Ethan's bringing investors with him after dinner." That sounded about right. My older sister had spent most of her life treating every family gathering like a campaign event. Perfect clothes. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. Claire Bennett Carlisle to be. Meanwhile, I was 52 years old, unmarried, driving a 10-year-old Ford pickup with 180,000 miles on it, and a coffee stain permanently baked into the passenger seat. In my family, that translated to failure. I stared through the windshield at the gray Virginia rain and thought about turning around. But my father was 78 now. And despite everything, there was still a part of me that kept hoping maybe one dinner would feel different. Maybe this time he'd look at me and see more than the quiet daughter who disappeared for deployments and never explained where she'd been. So I drove to the restaurant. The engagement dinner was at a waterfront steakhouse downtown overlooking the Elizabeth River. Expensive place, white tablecloths, valet parking. The kind of restaurant where men my father's age like to brag loudly enough for strangers to hear. The hostess smiled warmly at me until she noticed my plain navy peacoat and practical shoes. Then the smile turned professional instead of personal. Claire was already there when I arrived, glowing in cream-colored silk beside Ethan Carlisle. Now Ethan looked exactly how money was supposed to look. Silver hair at the temples. Tailored charcoal jacket. Gold watch probably worth more than my truck. He owned a defense manufacturing company outside Richmond. Claire talked about him like he was royalty. Hannah Claire stood to hug me lightly without wrinkling her dress. "You made it." "Traffic wasn't bad," I said. "That's because normal people aren't driving through military checkpoints all day," my father joked. Everybody chuckled. There were 8 people at the table altogether. Claire's future in-laws, a local banker, and one older couple Ethan did business with. I sat at the far end beside the window, exactly where people usually put me during family events. Out of the spotlight. Easy to ignore. And honestly, after enough years, you get used to it. The waiter came around pouring wine. "Not for me," I said. Claire smiled thinly, still on government rules. "Something like that." Her future mother-in-law leaned toward me politely. "So, what exactly do you do for the Navy, Hannah?" Before I could answer, my father laughed. "Oh, nothing exciting. She fixes radios or computers or something." More laughter. "She's always been the serious one," Claire added. "No social life whatsoever." "Well," Ethan said pleasantly, "military communications are important." "Sure," my father replied, "but Claire here actually knows how to live." That one got the biggest laugh of all. I smiled faintly and looked out at the river. At my age, humiliation doesn't hit like it does when you're young. It settles slower, quieter, like an old bruise you already know is there. Still, hearing your own father dismiss your entire life in front of strangers never stops hurting completely. Dinner continued. Steaks arrived. Business deals got discussed. Claire showed off engagement photos on her phone while my father bragged about Ethan's beach property in the Outer Banks. Not one person asked me another question after that. And honestly, I preferred it. Halfway through dessert, I excused myself to the restroom. When I came back, Ethan was standing near my chair. At first, I thought he was just being polite. Then I saw his expression. He was staring at my phone. I'd left it beside the bread plate. Specifically, he was staring at the insignia clipped to the back. Small. Silver. Easy to miss unless you knew exactly what it meant. And Ethan clearly did. His face lost all color. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. The whole table went silent at the tone in his voice. I picked up the phone calmly, long time ago. "That insignia..." His mouth actually twitched. No way. Claire frowned. "Ethan." He barely heard her. His eyes stayed locked on me. Then came the whisper. "Jesus Christ, it's really her." The room went dead quiet. My father blinked. What the hell's that supposed to mean? Ethan looked around the table like he suddenly regretted being there. "You didn't tell me your daughter was Hannah Bennett." My father snorted. "You already met her." "No," Ethan said carefully. "I mean Commander Bennett." I felt every eye at the table turn toward me. Claire gave a nervous laugh. "Commander Hannah works with radios." Ethan swallowed hard. Then he said something that changed the entire night. "Sir, there are people alive today because of your daughter." Nobody spoke after that. Not even my father. Outside the restaurant windows, rain rolled across the black water of the harbor, while the silence settled over the table like fog. And for the first time in my life, my family looked at me like they were seeing a stranger. I barely slept that night. Rain hammered against the windows of my townhouse until almost dawn, and sometime around 3 in the morning I gave up pretending rest was coming. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and listened to Norfolk wake up one truck engine at a time. At 52 years old, you learn silence has different meanings. Some silences feel peaceful. Others feel like a storm waiting offshore. The silence after that dinner felt dangerous. My phone started ringing before 7. I ignored the first 2 calls. Claire left a voicemail on the third. "What the hell was that last night, Hannah?" Not hello. Not "are you okay?" Just accusation. Classic Claire. I deleted the message without finishing it. 10 minutes later, my father called. I let that ring too. Then another call came through. Ethan Carlisle. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. "This is Hannah." There was hesitation on the other end, not the hesitation of a businessman, the hesitation of somebody choosing his words carefully. "Commander Bennett," he said quietly. "I retired 6 years ago." "Yes, ma'am." I closed my eyes. There it was again. That tone. Respect mixed with caution. I hadn't heard it from anyone at my family table in decades. "What do you want, Ethan?" "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For last night," I spoke out of turn. "You looked like you saw a ghost." A long silence followed. Then he exhaled slowly. "In some circles, he said, you kind of are one." I leaned back in my chair and watched rainwater slide down the kitchen window. "You shouldn't be calling me." "I know." "Then why are you—" Another pause. "Because your father thinks I embarrassed him. Claire thinks you intentionally humiliated her, and neither of them understands what happened." "That isn't my problem." "No," he admitted softly. "I suppose it isn't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan lowered his voice. "When I worked logistics contracting overseas, there was a communications officer people talked about. Nobody knew much, just stories, emergency extractions, failed missions turned around at the last second. SEAL teams getting home alive because one person kept comms running under impossible conditions." I rubbed my forehead. I already knew where this conversation was going. They said if Commander Bennett entered a room, he continued, everybody listened. "That was a long time ago." "Maybe," he said, "but some men don't forget the people who kept them breathing." I looked at the old magnet-covered refrigerator across the kitchen. My father's Navy photograph still hung there from 20 years earlier. Young Walter Bennett smiling proudly in grease-stained coveralls aboard the USS Forrestal. Funny thing was, my father understood military sacrifice perfectly well when it involved men like him. He just never understood it from me. I'm hanging up now, I said. Before Ethan could answer, I ended the call. Then I sat there staring into cold coffee for nearly 20 minutes. Around noon, I finally drove over to my father's house. He still lived in the same little brick ranch outside Chesapeake where Claire and I grew up. The American flag near the mailbox looked faded from salt air and age. So did my father. He opened the door wearing an old navy sweatshirt and reading glasses hanging low on his nose. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled like coffee, old wood furniture, and the faint trace of cigarette smoke that never completely leaves after 40 years. The television was on low in the living room, playing cable news nobody was really watching. My father sat heavily in his recliner. "You want to explain what happened last night?" I stayed standing. "Not particularly." His jaw tightened. "That boy acted like you were some damn 4-star general." "I wasn't." "But you were something." I looked toward the hallway where my mother's old photographs still hung untouched years after her death. "She's gone 3 years," I said quietly, "and you still haven't changed those frames." He frowned at the sudden shift. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Nothing," I said, "just noticing." He leaned forward. "Hannah." There was irritation in his voice now. Familiar irritation. The kind fathers use when they think daughters are being difficult instead of wounded. "What exactly did you do in the Navy?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 30 years he was finally asking. "You really want the answer?" "Yes." "No, you don't." "The hell I don't." I studied him for a moment. Age had softened him physically, but not emotionally. Walter Bennett still believed strength meant loudness, confidence, certainty. Men of his generation often did. And women like me learned early to survive quietly around men like that. "I worked communications intelligence," I said. "Meaning?" "Meaning when operations went bad, people called us." "That's it." "No," I answered calmly. "That's the part I'm allowed to tell you." His expression hardened again. "There you go, always secretive." I felt something sharp move through my chest then. Not anger exactly. Just exhaustion. "You know what's funny?" I asked. "What?" "You never complained when Claire kept secrets." "That's different." "Because she had glamorous secrets," I said. "Vacations, jewelry, rich men." "That ain't fair." "No," I replied quietly, "it really wasn't." The room fell silent. Outside I could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Normal suburban sounds? Ordinary life. The kind of life I spent decades missing. My father rubbed his face tiredly. "Ethan said people are alive because of you." I didn't answer. "Hannah." Finally I shrugged. "People are alive because of a lot of folks. That true?" "Yes." He stared at me carefully now. Not dismissively. Carefully. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had been sitting in front of him for years. "You were gone all the time," he murmured. I looked out the living room window. Deployments. Emergency recalls. Christmases spent inside steel communication rooms glowing blue at 3 in the morning. Birthdays missed. Funerals missed. My mother's final surgery delayed because I was halfway across the world coordinating extraction routes for men I never even met face to face. And through all of it, my family assumed I was some forgettable government technician. "You know," my father said slowly, "your mother used to defend you." That caught me off guard. She did. She'd say, "Leave Hannah alone. That girl carries things we don't understand." I swallowed hard. Because my mother had understood. Maybe not the classified details. But the weight. She saw it every time I came home quieter than before. My father looked down at his hands. "I thought maybe you just didn't care much about family." For a second I couldn't speak. Then finally I said the truth. I cared enough to stay away when I couldn't explain where I'd been. The old man looked up at me then. Really looked. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I think my father realized there were whole sections of my life he'd never even tried to understand. By Friday afternoon, Claire had turned the entire situation into a performance. That was her talent. Some people know how to sing. Some people know how to paint. Claire knew how to control a room. The charity gala was being held at the Hilton downtown, overlooking the harbor, some fundraiser for wounded veterans and military families. Ethan's company had sponsored half the event, which meant Claire had spent 2 solid weeks obsessing over centerpieces, guest lists, photographers, and whether the shrimp cocktail looked cheap. I wasn't planning to go. Then my father called Thursday night. "You should come." His voice sounded strange, softer than usual. "Claire doesn't want me there." "She invited you." "She invited me because Ethan told her to." A pause. Then quietly my father said, "Still, you should come." So Friday evening I drove downtown in my old Ford pickup while luxury sedans lined the hotel entrance beneath glowing valet lights. Norfolk looked beautiful at night after rain. Streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, ships sitting dark against the water. The kind of city that carries military history in its bones. I sat in the truck for a minute before going inside. Truth was, I suddenly felt tired. Not physically. Soul tired. There's a certain exhaustion that comes from spending your entire life being misunderstood by people you love. And lately, all those years felt heavier than usual. Inside the ballroom, everything gleamed gold and silver. Crystal chandeliers. White linen tables. Soft piano music drifting through hidden speakers. Claire stood near the entrance in a pale blue evening gown, greeting donors like she was running for office. When she saw me, her smile tightened slightly. "Hannah," she said carefully, "you came. You invited me." "Yes, well," she adjusted one diamond earring. "Try not to disappear tonight." I almost smiled at that. "I'll do my best." Claire glanced at my dress. Simple navy blue. "Nothing flashy." "You could have dressed up more," she muttered. I did. Before she could answer, another guest approached her and she immediately shifted into her polished social voice. I slipped away toward the back of the ballroom. That had always been my specialty. Blending into corners. Observing without being noticed. Military work teaches you that sometimes invisibility is survival. A waiter passed carrying bourbon glasses. I took one and stood near the windows overlooking the Elizabeth River. Outside, tugboats moved slowly through black water beneath distant shipyard lights. Beautiful view, isn't it? I turned. An older man stood beside me wearing a dark suit with navy posture that age hadn't erased. Late 70s, maybe. White hair cropped short. Sharp eyes. And immediately I recognized the lapel pin. Retired Admiral. "Yes, sir," I answered automatically. His mouth twitched faintly. "Still saying sir, I see." Then I recognized him. Admiral Robert Hastings, retired Special Warfare Command. I hadn't seen him in over 12 years. "Well," I said quietly, "this is unexpected." "You're telling me." He studied me carefully. "Word travels fast, Commander." I sighed softly. I was afraid of that. Across the ballroom, I noticed Ethan spot us. His expression changed instantly. Respect again. Nervousness, too. Admiral Hastings followed my glance. "So the young businessman knows who you are." "Unfortunately." The Admiral chuckled low in his throat. "You know my son still talks about you?" I looked back at him sharply. "Daniel. He's alive because of you." I looked away toward the harbor. "No," I said quietly. "He's alive because his team got themselves out." "That's not what they say." The Admiral's voice had changed now, less casual, more personal. "They said comms went dead during extraction. Total chaos. Then suddenly your voice came over the line, calm as Sunday morning. I felt old memories moving around in my chest. Heat. Static. Men shouting through damaged radios. Fear hidden beneath procedure. You remember everything he said softly. That's the problem with surviving certain things. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then another voice interrupted. Admiral Hastings. A local news reporter approached, smiling brightly. "We're doing brief interviews for the veterans segment. Would you mind?" She stopped mid-sentence after noticing me. The Admiral answered before she could continue. "Actually, he said you should be interviewing Commander Bennett." I stiffened immediately. "No." The reporter blinked. "Commander." "She doesn't do publicity," Hastings said calmly. Something about his tone made the reporter instantly back off. "Oh, of course, sorry." She walked away quickly. I exhaled. "You didn't need to do that." "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." Across the ballroom, people had started noticing us now. Claire especially. I could see confusion building behind her smile. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't the center of military attention in the room. Ethan crossed toward us carrying 2 bourbon glasses. "Admiral," he greeted respectfully. Then to me, "Commander Bennett." I accepted the drink with a nod. Claire arrived seconds later. "What's going on over here?" she asked lightly. Nobody answered immediately. That silence alone told her something was wrong. Admiral Hastings turned politely toward her. "You must be Hannah's sister." Claire smiled automatically. "Older sister." The Admiral nodded once. "Well, your sister saved my son's life." Claire's smile froze. "What?" Hastings looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't know." The room suddenly felt smaller. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Claire looked at him. "You knew." "Honey." "You knew." People nearby had started listening openly now. That's the thing about wealthy charity events. Nothing entertains rich people more than unexpected drama. Ethan lowered his voice. "Claire, not here." But it was already too late. Admiral Hastings spoke gently now, completely unaware he was detonating a family landmine. "Your sister coordinated one of the most successful emergency extraction recoveries special warfare ever conducted." Claire stared at me. I could practically see her entire understanding of me cracking apart in real time. "You fix radios," she said weakly. A strange little smile touched my mouth then. "Sometimes." The Admiral actually laughed. Then another man approached. And another. Older veterans. Former officers. Retired enlisted personnel. One after another greeting me with quiet recognition. Not celebrity. Not fame. Something deeper. Respect earned the hard way. Claire stood motionless beside Ethan while conversations formed around me like ripples spreading across water. For years, my sister had walked into rooms assuming she was the impressive Bennett daughter. Tonight, for the first time, she realized there had been another story unfolding quietly beside hers all along. And across the ballroom near the donor tables, I saw my father watching everything. Not smiling. Not bragging. Just staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite recognize yet. Maybe shock. Maybe regret. Or maybe the painful realization that he'd spent half a century misunderstanding his own daughter. My father showed up at my townhouse Sunday morning carrying a grocery bag full of biscuits and sausage gravy from a diner we used to visit when I was little. That alone told me something serious was happening. Walter Bennett never apologized directly. Men from his generation often didn't know how. Instead, they arrived with food fixed loose cabinet hinges or changed your oil without mentioning feelings. I opened the door wearing gray sweatpants and an old navy sweatshirt. He held up the paper bag awkwardly. "Figured you probably hadn't eaten." "It's 9 in the morning." "Exactly." I stepped aside to let him in. Outside, the weather had finally cleared after nearly a week of rain. Sunlight spilled across the small patch of grass behind my townhouse, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower buzzed steadily. Ordinary American Sunday morning. Inside my kitchen, though, tension followed us around like a third person. My father set the food on the counter and looked around the townhouse quietly. He'd only been inside twice before. That realization stung more than I expected. The place wasn't much. Small kitchen, worn hardwood floors, navy photographs packed away instead of displayed. A single recliner facing the television. Bookshelves filled with military history and radio manuals. The kind of home built for one person. "You keep this place neat," he muttered. "I'm not home enough to mess it up." The words slipped out before I could stop them. He noticed. Of course he did. We sat at the kitchen table eating in silence for several minutes. Then finally he cleared his throat. "Claire's upset." I gave a dry laugh. "Well, that narrows it down." "Hannah." "What?" "She thinks you embarrassed her at the gala." "I didn't do anything." "You could have warned us." I stared at him across the table. And just like that, irritation flared hot in my chest. Warned them. That was the problem right there. Even now, somehow, my family still viewed the situation as an inconvenience to them. "I spent 30 years not talking about classified operations," I said calmly. "You think I was supposed to announce myself over mashed potatoes?" His shoulders slumped slightly. "I didn't mean it like that." "Then how did you mean it?" He looked down at his coffee. For a moment, he suddenly looked every one of his 78 years. Old men shrink emotionally when certainty leaves them. And lately my father seemed uncertain about everything. He exhaled slowly. I feel like I don't know who you are anymore. The words settled heavily between us. I leaned back in my chair. That makes two of us. His eyes lifted. What's that supposed to mean? I hesitated. Because the truth was dangerous. Not classified dangerous anymore. Emotionally dangerous. You know what the hardest part of intelligence work is? I asked quietly. He frowned. What? Coming home? The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I looked past him toward the window, but I wasn't really seeing the neighborhood anymore. I was seeing Bahrain. Djibouti. Dark operations rooms glowing blue at 2 a.m. while exhausted men tried not to die thousands of miles from home. You spend years learning how to shut pieces of yourself off, I said. You compartmentalize everything. Fear, grief, stress. You bury it because people depend on you staying calm. My father listened without interrupting. And after enough years I continued, you don't really know how to turn it back on again. He swallowed hard. Is that why you stayed away so much? Partly. But not entirely. There was someone, I said quietly. My father blinked. A man. I nodded once. His surprise actually hurt a little. As though he'd genuinely believed nobody could ever love me. We were engaged, I said. The room went completely still. When? Long time ago. Why didn't you tell us? I smiled faintly without humor. You never asked. That one landed. Hard. My father stared at the table silently. After a moment he said, What happened to him? I looked down at my hands. Even now, 20 years later, speaking about Michael still felt like touching broken glass. He was Navy, I said softly. Special operations. My father nodded slowly. Good man. The best one I ever knew. Outside somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice. I could smell sausage gravy cooling on the counter. Normal life continuing while old ghosts climbed out of storage. He died during an operation overseas. My father closed his eyes briefly. Oh, honey. It wasn't supposed to go wrong. I rarely spoke about this part aloud. Not because it was classified anymore. Because guilt ages differently than grief. Grief softens eventually. Guilt does not. There were communication failures, I said carefully. Confusion, delays, bad intelligence. My father's face tightened. You blame yourself. I laughed once under my breath. Occupational hazard. Hannah. I was coordinating recovery support, I interrupted quietly. I kept thinking if I'd caught one detail faster. If I'd rerouted one transmission sooner. But you don't know that. No, I admitted, I don't. That was the worst part. Uncertainty. People imagine military trauma as explosions and gunfire. Sometimes it's paperwork. Radio silence. A voice that never answers again. My father stared at me with a kind of heartbreak I'd never seen in him before. You carried all that alone? Yes. Why? I almost answered immediately, then stopped. Because the real answer was ugly. Because every time I came home, Claire's achievements filled the room while my silence made everyone uncomfortable. Because talking about death over Thanksgiving dinner tends to ruin the mood. Because eventually I learned my family preferred the simplified version of me. Quiet Hannah. The Navy tech. The daughter who fixed radios. It was easier, I finally said. My father rubbed both hands over his face slowly. Oh God. I looked away. You know what the funny thing is? What? I let you believe it. His eyes lifted again. All these years, I let everyone underestimate me because it hurt less than trying to explain things they didn't want to hear. My father stood abruptly and walked toward the sink. For several seconds he just stood there staring out the kitchen window. Then he spoke so quietly I almost missed it. Your mother knew something was wrong after he died. I froze. She did. She told me you came home different. He swallowed hard, quieter, older somehow. A lump rose into my throat unexpectedly. Because my mother had noticed. Of course she had. She said one day you'd either tell us the truth, his voice cracked slightly, or disappear from us completely. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too full of things unsaid. My father turned back toward me then, and for the first time since I was a little girl I saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not authority. Not disappointment. Pain. Real pain. I failed you, he whispered. I looked down at my coffee because suddenly I couldn't look at him anymore. And in that moment, after decades of silence between us, the distance separating father and daughter finally began to break. For the next few weeks, my father started calling me almost every day. At first, the conversations were awkward. Painfully awkward. Walter Bennett had spent 78 years communicating through sarcasm, sports scores, and weather reports. Emotional honesty hit him like learning a foreign language late in life. Still, he kept trying. That mattered. Sometimes he called just to ask whether I'd eaten dinner. Sometimes he asked questions about Navy life he should have asked 20 years earlier. And sometimes he simply sat on the phone quietly, because neither of us quite knew how to bridge 50 years of misunderstanding overnight. One Thursday afternoon, he invited me to lunch. "There's somebody I want you to see," he said. I met him at a small seafood restaurant near the Chesapeake shipyards, the kind of place with paper napkin dispensers, fried flounder baskets, and old military plaques hanging crooked on the walls. 3 older men sat waiting at a corner table when I arrived. All veterans. All roughly my father's age, and all staring at me with immediate recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," one of them muttered as I approached. "That's really her." "Afternoon, Commander," another said respectfully. I stopped beside the table. "Gentlemen." My father looked oddly nervous. "Hannah, this is Pete Rollins, Ray Mercer, and Joe Donnelly. We served together back in the 70s. I shook their hands one by one. Rough old hands. Working men's hands? The generation that fixed carriers, loaded ammunition, and smoked cigarettes in engine rooms, while America pretended they were indestructible. "You never told us your daughter was Hannah Bennett," Pete said to my father. Walter gave a weak shrug. "Didn't know myself, apparently." Nobody laughed at that. Joe Donnelly leaned back, slowly studying me. "My nephew was with Naval Special Warfare in Afghanistan," he said. "He heard your voice over comms during a recovery op." I stiffened slightly. "That was a long time ago." "Maybe," Joe replied, "but he still talks about it." I sat down quietly. The waitress came by pouring coffee while the men continued talking. Stories drifted around the table. Military memories. Old deployments. Friends buried too young. The older you get, the more conversations revolve around people no longer alive. That's something younger folks rarely understand about aging. You carry a cemetery in your memory. At one point, Pete looked toward me and said softly, "Your father used to brag about Claire constantly." Walter's face tightened immediately. Pete realized too late what he'd said. But I just sipped coffee calmly. "It's all right," I said. "He's not wrong. Claire gave him things he understood." Walter stared down at his plate. After lunch, the other veterans left first. Joe paused beside my father before heading out. "You know," he said quietly, "most men would kill for a daughter like her." Then he walked away. My father sat motionless for several seconds after the door closed. Finally, he whispered, "I think I spent my whole life admiring the wrong things." Outside, gulls circled above the gray water near the shipyard cranes. I watched old cargo workers loading equipment onto a rusted freighter while silence settled between us again. Then my father suddenly asked, "Were you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "In the Navy. In life." I looked out the window for a long moment before answering honestly. "Sometimes." He nodded slowly. I kept thinking success looked like Claire. I smiled faintly. Most people do. Claire had the life Americans were taught to admire. Beautiful home. Wealthy fiancé. Country club friends. Vacation photos. Meanwhile, I had government pensions, bad knees, and enough classified memories to wake me up at night. But there are different kinds of purpose. Different kinds of loneliness, too. "She called me yesterday," my father admitted. "Claire. She's angry." "That's not new." He sighed heavily. "She thinks you made her look foolish." I almost laughed. "No, reality did that." Walter rubbed his forehead tiredly. "She says you enjoyed humiliating her." That one stung unexpectedly. Because the truth was exactly the opposite. I'd spent my entire adult life shrinking myself to keep peace inside that family. "I never wanted any of this attention," I said quietly. "I know." "Do you?" He looked at me carefully. "Yes," he answered softly, "I finally do." A few days later, Claire showed up at my townhouse unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there in oversized sunglasses despite cloudy weather. "That dramatic now?" I asked. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside silently. She walked into my living room looking uncomfortable immediately. Claire hated spaces without decoration or performance. My townhouse felt too honest for her. "You want coffee?" I asked. "No." I waited. Finally, she crossed her arms. "Ethan says people in Washington know your name." "Some people. He says military officers practically worship you." I shrugged lightly. "That's an exaggeration." Claire stared at me hard. "You really saved all those people?" The question sounded strangely childlike. I sat down slowly in the recliner across from her. "You know what most military work actually is?" I asked. "Long hours, fear, mistakes, trying to bring people home alive." She looked away. "I thought you were ashamed of your life." That one hurt more than she realized. "Why?" "Because you never talked about it." I studied my sister quietly. Claire had spent her whole life chasing visibility. Meanwhile, I'd spent mine surviving invisibility. Neither of us understood the other. "I wasn't ashamed," I said softly. "I was tired." She blinked rapidly a few times, then finally whispered, "Dad looks at you differently now." There it was. The real wound. Not the gala. Not the embarrassment. Fear. Fear that the family hierarchy she'd depended on her entire life had shifted beneath her feet. "You know something sad?" I said gently. "What?" "I never wanted him to admire me more than you." Claire's eyes watered unexpectedly. For the first time since childhood, she looked small instead of polished. "I think I spent my whole life competing with you," she admitted quietly. "You were the only one competing." Silence. Then finally she asked the question that mattered most. "Why didn't you ever tell us who you really were?" I looked around the small townhouse. At the packed-away photographs. At the quiet. At the years. And finally I gave her the answer. Because nobody in this family ever seemed interested in the quiet daughter. Claire started crying then. Not dramatic tears, real ones. The kind that arrive when illusion finally breaks. And sitting there watching my older sister fall apart in my living room, I realized something important. Revenge doesn't always come through destruction. Sometimes the deepest revenge is simply letting the truth stand in full daylight. The storm hit Norfolk on a Tuesday night. Not a hurricane. Not one of those disasters that makes national headlines for weeks. Just one of those brutal coastal storms that locals know how to fear anyway. Heavy rain, sudden flooding, wind strong enough to shake old windows and knock branches across power lines. By 6 in the evening, half the city was already underwater. I was sitting in my townhouse listening to emergency radio traffic when my phone rang. "Claire." That alone told me something was wrong. "Hannah." Her voice sounded shaky. "Slow down," I said immediately. "What happened?" "Dad's neighborhood lost power. Some apartment building near the marina flooded and people are trapped upstairs." In the background, I heard wind hammering against windows. "Where's Dad?" "He drove over there with neighbors because people were screaming for help." I stood instantly. "Stay inside, I'm coming." The roads looked like rivers by the time I reached Chesapeake. Rain slammed sideways across the windshield, while emergency sirens echoed through dark streets. Norfolk always smelled faintly like salt water, but during storms, the entire city seemed swallowed by the Atlantic. When I reached my father's neighborhood, chaos had already taken over. Police lights flashed red and blue through heavy rain. Neighbors crowded sidewalks in ponchos and work boots. And 2 blocks ahead, muddy floodwater surged around an old apartment complex built back in the 70s. People were trapped on the second floor waving flashlights through windows. I spotted my father near a fire truck arguing with a police officer. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted over the wind. Walter turned. Relief hit his face instantly. "Hannah." I crossed through ankle-deep water toward him. "There are elderly folks still inside," he said breathlessly. The stairwell collapsed. A young firefighter nearby looked exhausted. "We're trying to reach them from the rear access," he said, "but water's rising too fast." I scanned the building automatically. Old construction. Narrow maintenance access along the eastern side. Electrical lines already down. Panic everywhere. And underneath all of it, something familiar settled calmly into place inside me. Focus. The strange thing about crisis is that some people become emotional while others become precise. Military work trained precision into my bones. How many trapped, I asked. Maybe 12, the firefighter answered. Mobility issues. Most of them. I nodded once. Then I pointed toward a maintenance shed half submerged near the parking lot. Do you have emergency radios? The firefighter blinked. Some? Bring them. Walter stared at me quietly while I stepped into command mode without thinking. People nearby began moving almost automatically once instructions started coming clearly. That's another thing about emergencies. Most folks aren't waiting for heroes. They're waiting for calm. Within minutes, we had radios distributed, flashlights organized, and evacuation routes mapped around the flooded alleyways. The police lieutenant approached me. You law enforcement? No. Military? Retired Navy. He looked relieved anyway. Well, ma'am, right now you're the only organized person here. Rainwater soaked through my jacket as I moved between responders coordinating access points. I could hear frightened residents shouting from upstairs windows. One elderly woman cried continuously for her husband. A younger officer nearby whispered nervously, "This building's not stable." I looked at the sagging eastern wall. He was right. Time mattered. Fast. Get me 2 volunteers with ropes, I ordered. My father grabbed my arm. Hannah, don't. I know what I'm doing. You don't have to prove anything. I looked directly at him. This isn't about proving anything. Then I moved toward the flooded side entrance. Inside the building smelled like seawater mildew and electrical smoke. Water surged around my knees while emergency flashlights bounced across cracked walls. The second-floor residents were terrified. Mostly elderly. Wheelchairs. Walkers. Oxygen tanks. The kind of people disasters forget first. Everybody listen to me, I shouted calmly. We're getting you out one at a time. Fear changes when somebody sounds certain. Panic softens. People breathe again. That's what leadership actually is. Not power. Not money. Steadiness. An older man grabbed my sleeve as we secured ropes near the stairwell. My wife can't walk, he said shakily. We'll carry her. You promise? I looked him directly in the eyes. Yes. And I meant it. For the next hour, we moved residents slowly through rising water, while firefighters stabilized the rear structure enough for evacuations. My knees screamed. My shoulders burned. But adrenaline and old training carried me forward. Outside, the storm kept raging. At one point, the lights from emergency vehicles reflected across floodwater so brightly the whole street glowed red and blue like a war zone. I heard my father's voice somewhere outside, helping coordinate residents arriving safely. And strangely enough, hearing him sound proud instead of dismissive hurt almost more than the years he ignored me. Near the end of the evacuation, one frightened elderly woman refused to leave without her little terrier trapped under a bed upstairs. The firefighters argued. The structure was becoming unstable. I went anyway. Found the trembling dog behind broken furniture. And when I carried that tiny, shaking animal downstairs wrapped inside my jacket, the old woman burst into tears, hugging me. You came back, she kept repeating. Of course I did. That's what service means. Outside, rain finally began easing around midnight. Ambulances lined the street while soaked residents huddled beneath emergency blankets. The police lieutenant approached me holding a cup of bad coffee. You military folks are built different, he muttered. I almost smiled. No, I said quietly, just trained. Across the flooded parking lot, I spotted Claire standing beside my father beneath a fire department canopy. Both of them watching me. But differently now. Not as the quiet embarrassment of the family. Not as the daughter who fixes radios. They were looking at me the way people look at someone after finally understanding what they're capable of. And honestly, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Very tired. Because after a lifetime of silence, being truly seen carries its own kind of weight. As EMTs loaded the last residents into warming vans, a local news crew suddenly arrived splashing through puddles with cameras. The reporter hurried toward me eagerly. Ma'am, we heard a retired Navy officer coordinated. I handed the coffee to a firefighter and quietly stepped away before she could finish. No speeches. No interviews. No spotlight. Some habits never leave you. I walked toward my truck alone beneath fading rain while emergency lights flashed behind me across black floodwater. And somewhere near the ambulances I heard my father telling someone in a quiet, emotional voice, "That's my daughter." 3 weeks after the storm, my father invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. Not a restaurant. Not a fundraiser. Not some polished social event designed to impress strangers. Just family. The way it used to be before life became complicated. I almost said no out of habit. Then something in his voice stopped me. "Please come, Hannah." So that Sunday afternoon I drove out to the old brick ranch house beneath a pale Virginia sky, while autumn leaves drifted across quiet suburban streets. Norfolk looked softer in the fall. Less military. More human. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed my father had hung a brand new American flag beside the porch. The old faded one was gone. Inside the house smelled like roast chicken, black pepper, and fresh biscuits. Claire was already there helping in the kitchen, wearing jeans instead of designer dresses for once. That alone felt strange enough to make me pause. She looked up nervously when I entered. "Hey. Hey." For a second, neither of us moved. Then Claire crossed the kitchen and hugged me tightly. Not politely. Not performatively. Like a sister. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. Something loosened quietly in my chest. Maybe healing starts in moments that small. My father appeared from the dining room carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes. "Well," he muttered awkwardly, "don't just stand there, food's getting cold." Some things never change. And honestly, thank God for that. Dinner started quietly. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while an old Frank Sinatra record played low in the background. The same one my mother used to play every Sunday when Claire and I were kids. For a while, conversation stayed simple. Football. Weather. Claire's wedding plans. Ordinary things. But underneath it all, something unspoken waited at the table with us. Eventually, my father set down his fork. His hands looked older lately. Thinner. Slightly unsteady. "Hannah," he said. I looked up. He swallowed once before continuing. "I need to say something." The room went still. Claire lowered her eyes immediately. My father looked directly at me. Not past me. Not around me. At me. I spent a lot of years being proud of the wrong things. I didn't speak. He continued carefully, like every word cost effort. I admired money, appearances, people who talked loud. He gave a faint, sad smile. I thought success meant being noticed. The old wall clock ticked softly in the silence. Then his voice roughened. And all that time, my quiet daughter was out serving her country while I made jokes about radios. Emotion rose unexpectedly into my throat. My father took off his glasses slowly. "I embarrassed you," he whispered, "for years." Nobody moved. Outside, wind brushed softly through dead leaves. "I can't get back the birthdays I missed understanding you," he said, "or the times I made you feel small." His eyes glistened now. "But if there's any grace left in this life," he exhaled shakily, "I'd like to spend whatever time I have left doing better." I stared down at the table because suddenly looking at him hurt too much. All those years. All that silence. And somehow this old stubborn Navy mechanic had finally found the words. Claire reached over quietly and squeezed my hand. Then she spoke too. "I owe you an apology." I glanced toward her. She looked nothing like the polished social queen from the gala anymore. Just tired. "Honest. I spent my whole life thinking attention meant value," she admitted softly, "and I treated you like background noise because you weren't loud about what you did." Tears filled her eyes. "When Ethan told me people respected you, I was jealous. The honesty of it stunned me. I thought if Dad admired you," she laughed weakly through tears, "maybe there wouldn't be enough left for me." "Oh, Claire." "No," she said quickly, "you deserve to hear it." For a moment nobody spoke again. Then my father stood slowly and disappeared down the hallway. He returned carrying an old framed photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. Our family standing together outside Naval Station Norfolk sometime around 1989. My mother smiling brightly between Claire and me. My father younger and stronger beside us. before life hardened everybody. He placed the photograph carefully in the center of the table. I used to think the loudest life was the most important one, he said quietly. Then he looked at me. I was wrong. I finally felt tears slide down my face then. Not dramatic crying, just quiet grief leaving the body after years of being stored too long. We sat there together for a long time after dinner ended, talking honestly for maybe the first time in our lives, about my mother, about Michael, about the years we lost misunderstanding one another. And slowly the Bennett family stopped feeling like strangers sharing blood. Later that evening after sunset, I drove alone to Arlington National Cemetery. The air smelled cold and clean beneath rows of white headstones stretching into darkness. I walked quietly through familiar silence, carrying a small bundle of flowers. Michael's grave sat beneath an old oak tree near the eastern section. I knelt slowly, placing the flowers down carefully. For several minutes I said nothing at all. Just listened to wind moving through the trees. People think sacrifice always looks heroic. Sometimes it looks lonely. Sometimes it looks like missed holidays, broken relationships, and carrying memories nobody around you can fully understand. But service matters anyway, even when nobody sees it. Especially then. As I stood to leave, I looked across the cemetery one last time and thought about my father's words. The loudest life is not always the most meaningful one. Sometimes the strongest people are the quiet ones, sitting unnoticed at the edge of the table. And maybe that's worth remembering.